Okay, welcome back to another online lecture of macroeconomics. This is the third lecture in a series of lectures on money and banking. So in this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about the loan creation process and how the modern banking system works. And we need to go back in time. We're going to go back in time to a period where we talk about mercantilism, where merchants would travel from place to place on ships or in caravans, trading different various items, whether it's spices or furs or lumber or jewels or whatever it might be that they were in a particular business of trading. And for centuries, for a long period of time, all of these transactions took place through the exchange of gold. In other words, gold was the money. And this was gold was an excellent item commodity to use as money because it was readily accepted as a medium of exchange. It was a pretty good store of value, and it was also an excellent unit of account. So it performed the three functions of money that we spoke of earlier. Right? That's the great news about gold. But there's some bad news about gold too. The bad news about gold is that number one, it's cumbersome. In other words, if you need to carry around a good deal of gold around with you, right? It weighs a good deal and needs to be stored somewhere. The other problem is that pirates. We've all seen the Pirates of the Caribbean, but it was probably no joke to these merchants. So it was dangerous to carry that much gold because of thievery and such, and people, evildoers, right? So the merchants came up with a system to protect their interest and their well-being, and that is employ the services of a goldsmith. Right? So the goldsmith had a very simple job. The goldsmith would simply protect the gold of these merchants and issue receipts for the gold. Right? And so obviously the goldsmith would charge them a small fee. So let's use a very simple example here. We'll talk about how the lending process began and how this actually has some connection to the modern banking system. So let's assume for simplicity that there were 10 merchants in our little trading world. And let's assume that for simplicity as well that each of these 10 merchants had exactly $100,000 worth of gold, right? So if they all use the same goldsmith, we'll creatively call him Goldie Goldsmith, right? They all use Goldie Goldsmith, and they all drop off their $100,000 worth of gold to the goldsmith. The goldsmith issues them each $100,000 worth of receipts, right? So now in total, there was 10 times 100,000 or $1 million worth of receipts in circulation. And this, quickly became evident that these receipts could be used as paper money. So in other words, the merchants were just as happy trading the receipts as they were trading the gold, because they knew if their desires so carry them, they could simply go back to the goldsmith and redeem the receipts for gold, at the point in time in which they wished. So after quite some time, right, the goldsmith started to get lonely, right? Because number one, two things happen here. The first is that we now went from a commodity money to a commodity backed money. In other words, in the beginning of the story, gold was the money, and at this point, the receipts are a representation of the gold, so they are commodity backed money, right? But if all of the merchants use the receipts because number one, they weren't as heavy, and it was they're also easier to hide, so they weren't as cumbersome, and it was less dangerous for them to carry around these receipts. The goldsmith really didn't need to be seen all that often, especially if all the merchants were just as happy trading these receipts. Now, along comes an inventive and industrious person someday into the goldsmith's office and says, all of those merchants travel through our town from time to time, and we don't really reap any of the benefits. What we need here is we need a general store. If we had a general store, then every time they traveled into our little town here, they would buy goods from us, and we would reap the benefit. We would make some money off of selling goods at a general store. And the goldsmith agrees and says, "That's a wonderful idea. Why don't you build this store and you'll make the money?" And the man says, "Well, I have a great idea. The only problem is I don't have any money to get this store up and running." So the goldsmith creatively thinks and says, "Everybody readily accepts the receipts that I have issued as money. So as long as I issue another set of receipts, they will be accepted in exchange for goods and services, and you can use those receipts to build up your store." But here's the catch: you have to pay me back these receipts after you get the store up and running. So in essence, what you have here is you have the first loan, right? So the goldsmith is now the banker. So think of it in simple math terms again. In the beginning, you had exactly $1 million worth of gold stored at the goldsmiths and $1 million worth of paper receipts circulating in this small economy. Let's assume for simplicity that the man who decided to build a general store, he borrowed exactly $100,000 worth of receipts. So now you have $1.1 million worth of receipts, but only $1 million worth of gold, right? So another important idea associated with this story is the fractional reserve system. Right? There's only a fraction of gold that now backs the receipts in circulation. Right? So two important economic lessons thus far is number one is that we went from a commodity money, the gold, to a commodity-backed money with the paper receipts. And the second important idea here is the fractional reserve system. Right? Another extremely important idea, and this is actually the way the modern banking system works, when the goldsmith issued additional receipts, when the goldsmith granted a loan, money was created. Because if you think about what happened, the total number of receipts in this economy went from 1 million to 1.1 million, or 1,100,000, right? So when loans are granted, money is created. Now let's assume it took the builder of this store, the person who got this store up and running, let's say it took him 3 years to pay back the receipts, right? Well, after 3 years, there would be exactly $1 million worth of receipts in circulation and $1 million worth of gold at the goldsmith's store of place there. So again, we'd be back to a one-to-one system where there was the exact number of gold receipts. Receipts issued by the goldsmith as there was gold in circulation. Second important idea here is that when loans are repaid, money is destroyed, right? So that's exactly the way the modern banking system works, right? The only difference is that the modern banking system, there's no longer any gold backing the money, right? But we're going to see that it's the deposits of individuals and corporations into banks that are the engine for the money creation process that banks are able to make available for the general economy. Now, last important idea here is the idea of panics, right? So, if you remember that scene in The Wonderful Life where the Jimmy Stewart character is trying to explain to all the people who show up at his banks and, I don't have your money, it's at Bill's and Bob's. So if you were the goldsmith back in the day, you had to be what was called a frugal lender, right? You had to be intelligent because if the goldsmith started to create too many loans, right? So in our simple example, first there was $1 million worth of receipts, each backed by $1 million worth of gold, right? Then the goldsmith made one loan for $100,000, so there's now $1.1 million worth of receipts and $1 million worth of gold. So back to that fractional reserve system. The question is, how far can the goldsmith push it without risking the possibility that all of the merchants who had deposited gold at his place of business all showed up at the same time demanding their gold. So, in other words, bank panics could occur because there was no assurance to any of the depositors that the gold would be there upon their return. Right? Now, in the modern banking system today, the reason why there are no runs on banks or banks panics is that we have what's called FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which prior to 2007, it insured up to and including $100,000 into any bank account, and now it actually insures up to $250,000 in any account in a bank. So the reason we don't have runs on banks today is not because all banks are solid or solvent. Right? As we know, lots of banks failed during this last financial crisis. The reason we don't have bank panics is because depositors understand and can sleep well at night knowing that the FDIC insurance program guarantees that no matter what happens, their deposits will be fulfilled if they want to redeem the money they have deposited into a bank. Well, the textbook goes into some detail about the accounting and the accounting equation and the accounting, the T accounts at banks. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, but we'll spend a little more time on this when we actually look at the Federal Reserve in the next chapter. But for now, I usually don't spend a great deal of time on this particular part of the chapter. We'll just go over it in simplest terms and enough detail that we can use it as a springboard for what's really important, the economic lessons associated with banking. So the the balance sheet equation you have up here, assets equals liability plus net worth. That is the fundamental accounting equation. So for those of you who have already taken accounting, I'm quite certain you're familiar with this equation, right? It's the basis for which all accounting is developed, right? So it's the fundamental accounting equation. So for instance, assets, right? So if you think about a business, they have assets such as cash and equipment and land and buildings and such, right? So all of those would add up to a certain amount. Let's just use easy math here. So okay, let's assume that all of their assets added up to $500,000. That means their assets will have to equal the total of their liabilities plus net worth. So liabilities are what a business owes others, whether it's other individuals or other institutions or other people they bought supplies from and have not yet paid, right? So those are your liabilities. And then net worth is obviously what we call owner's equity, right? So if this particular business had $250,000 worth of liabilities, then by default they'd also have $250,000 worth of net worth because $500,000 in assets would have to equal the liabilities plus the net worth. So this always balances, right? And then the book goes into this whole idea of how a bank is created. That okay, depositors deposit money, and then right. Well, let's just keep it in simplest terms so you understand the basic idea of the balance sheet for the bank, right? When individuals or businesses deposit monies into a bank, those deposits are a liability to the bank because it's not their money. Obviously, it's the depositor's money, right? So the assets in the bank are obviously the building and then maybe whatever financial uh, instruments that the bank purchases and such. So the assets will equal the liabilities plus the net worth. The most important idea here is this idea of excess reserves, right? In a previous lecture, in lecture number 2, we went over some of the Fed functions, right? This is the most important idea associated with this particular part of the lecture. We said one of the Fed functions is to set the reserve requirement and hold reserves. So currently, the reserve requirement in the United States is 10%. So this idea that banks are in a position to make loans and therefore make new monies if they have excess reserves. So if a bank in total has taken in $1 million worth of deposits, right? That bank can safely lend out 90% of those deposits, right? So obviously 90% of $1 million is 900,000. So that bank would be in a position, assuming they haven't granted any loans yet, or this is the first day they open, they've taken $1 million worth of deposits, they can create $900,000 worth of loans and therefore new monies. We're going to go over this equation in more detail in the next couple of slides as well. So this idea here that if we take a bank's actual reserves minus its required reserves, it will grant us the excess reserves at that bank, right? So down bottom here we have a pretty straightforward example. Assume that an individual strolls into a bank and deposits $100. Now I don't know why McConnell uses the example of a 20% reserve requirement for the book purpose, but that is the exact same example in the book, so I'm going to stick with this. So assume that somebody strolls into a bank, deposits $100. Right? You say, okay, well, how much can that bank safely lend out? Well, if $100 is deposited into the bank and there is a 20% reserve requirement, that bank is now in a position to lend out $80, right? Because $20 would be required reserves. So the actual reserves in this case would be 100. The required reserves would be 20, and the excess reserves would be 80. So that bank can safely lend out $80, right? Assuming that they haven't made any loans to this point yet. Now, this is an extremely important idea, and we're going to use this as a stepping board to explain the banking system. Say, okay, let's stick with this first uh, bank. So I stroll into Bank A, I deposit $100. Right? If the reserve requirement is 20%, I would say, okay, that Bank A must keep $20 as required reserve, and then has excess reserves of 80. Now, we're going to assume two things throughout this process. So, okay, if we're trying to figure out how much new monies the entire banking system can create when a new deposit is made at some bank, we have to make two important assumptions. The first one is that banks lend out all excess reserves. In other words, banks do not hold excess reserves or hoard excess reserves. And that's typically a safe assumption, especially during good economic times, because this is how banks make money. They make money by lending out money and charging interest. So the first assumption is that banks lend out all of their excess reserves. The second assumption is that all new monies, all loans granted, are immediately redeposited into the next bank. So if I stroll into the bank and deposit $100, right, my bank's in a position to lend out $80, assuming there's a reserve requirement of 20%. How much can the entire banking system create if this takes place? Right, so we look here in column 3, we say, okay, so the first bank can lend out safely $80. So let's say that's Bank of America, that's Bank A. Right? So Bank A, Bank of America, they make a loan to an individual, right, who's interested in buying a car, right, and they get the $80. They deposit the entire $80 into their bank, Bank B. We'll say that Bank B is Wells Fargo. So now Wells Fargo has $80 worth of new deposits. That's their right reserve. That's their actual reserve. Well, the required reserve there is 16 or 20% of that. They're in a position to lend out $64, right? So you can see we could take this step by step by step and say, okay, the entire banking system then in total could lend out $400. Well, this would be an extremely cumbersome process, and I think most of the students of economics would dislike me highly if I actually made you go through this step by step by step by each bank. The question is there a more efficient way to determine how much the banking system in total can loan out and create new monies when a initial deposit is made into a bank? Right? Well, here's the tool that we use. We use what's called the money multiplier. Right? Economists use this tool, the money multiplier. So the money multiplier is easy to calculate. If you know the required reserve or the reserve ratio, you simply take 1 divided by that, and that gives you your money multiplier, right? So 1 divided by 0.2, right? Because in the previous slide we assumed that the reserve requirement was 20%. So if the reserve requirement is 20%, 1 divided by 0.2 means there is a money multiplier of 5. 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. Okay? So in our previous example, right, $100 was deposited into the first bank. If we're trying to figure out how much money in total the banking system can create, if there is a reserve requirement of 20% and an initial deposit of 100, all we have to do is, number 1, calculate the size of the money multiplier, and number 2, figure out the amount of the initial excess reserves. So we have this little graph down bottom here that shows us this, right? This is pretty straightforward. The money multiplier was 5, as I previously explained. Right, and 5 times 80, the initial excess reserves, gives us our 400. So that's a much more efficient, straightforward, easy way to calculate how much money the banking system can create. All right, so let's go through that one more time. Right, when a deposit is made at the bank, right, first we figure out what is the excess reserves after we've taken out the required reserves. So if we take the initial excess reserves times the size of the money multiplier, we can figure out how much money in total the banking system can create. Now remember, there's 2 important caveats or 2 important assumptions we made about this entire process. The first assumption is that banks will lend out all of their excess reserves, and the second important assumption is that all new monies, all new loans are immediately redeposited into the next bank. Okay? Now, real quickly, I'm going to go through the same example but with a different reserve requirement, I'm going to show you why the reserve requirement is the most powerful tool of monetary policy. Let's assume for a moment that the reserve requirement is no longer 20% but 10%, right? So okay, we have to put that into our equation to figure out the money multiplier. So the money multiplier equals 1 over the reserve requirement, right? So if the required reserve ratio is 10%, 1 divided by 0.1, 10%, 1 divided by 0.1 is 10. So now that's double the size of the money multiplier, right? So if the reserve requirement is only 10%, we have a money multiplier of 10, right? Now let's assume that $100 is still deposited into the bank. We also have to figure out, okay, because the reserve requirement now is only 10%, Bank A is in a position to lend out $90, right? More than the $80 when the reserve requirement was 20%, right? So the reason why the reserve requirement is the most powerful tool of monetary policy is that because changes in the reserve requirement would automatically alter the size of the money multiplier and likewise directly affect or impact the amount of excess reserves that banks hold, right? So if we go through the entire process for this example using a 10% reserve requirement, right? 1 divided by 0.1, right? Money multiplier is 10. 10 times, in this case, 90. Right? Now the banking system can create $900 worth of new monies. So you see how powerful a tool this is of monetary policy. Right? With a reserve requirement of 20%, the money multiplier was only 5, and the initial excess reserves was 80, so 5 times 80 was 400. If the money multiplier is 10%, right? If the required reserve is 10%, the money multiplier is 10. 10 times 90, the banking system can now create greater than twice the amount it did previously. So I figured a good way to finish this particular lecture was to go over a practical example from something that might occur in the real economy. So here we have an example of, let's assume that there's a large deposit in Bank of America made this morning for $50,000. So all the way on the left you see BOA, that stands for Bank of America. So there's a $50,000 deposit in Bank of America, right? So it tells you above that information for the Bank of America deposit that the required reserve or the reserve ratio here is 10%, just like it is in the real world today, right? So we're assuming that we're operating under the actual laws that the Federal Reserve has determined for our U.S. economy here in 2012, right? So if the required reserve or the reserve ratio is 10%, what's the size of the money multiplier? Right? Well, the money multiplier can be calculated by 1 over the required reserve, right? So 1 divided by 0.1, right? So in our economy today, we have a money multiplier of 10, right? That's the actual money multiplier operating in today's economy because the required reserve set by the Federal Reserve, right? So we have a money multiplier of 10. So if there is a $50,000 deposit made in Bank of America, right? What's the excess reserves and what are the required reserves? Well, the required reserves would simply be 10% of the 50,000. So you see that all the way on the right, right? All the way on the right we see that 10% of 50,000 is 5,000. So this Bank of America must keep either in their bank vaults or on deposit with the Fed 5,000 out of this 50,000, right? Therefore, Bank of America is in a position to lend out or to safely create $45,000 worth of new monies or new loans, right? So let's go ahead and assume that the Bank of America lends out the entire $45,000, right? And let's also assume, like in our previous example, that all new deposits, all new loans are immediately redeposited into another bank, right? So therefore we say, okay, how much money can the entire banking system create? Well, just like in the previous example, we simply just take the size of the money multiplier here. The money multiplier is 10. We times that by the initial excess reserves, and that would give us $450,000 worth of total money that the banking system as an entire entity can create. Right, so money multiplier times initial excess reserves equals total money creation process of the entire banking system. So in this case, 10 times the initial excess reserves of $45,000 gives us a grand total of $450,000 that the banking system can create in total.